Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session. This is Trust in Action, County Level Partnerships for Health Equity and Community Voice. Thank you all for choosing to watch this panel. I'm going to get us started and keep things moving today. Overview of what you can expect in this session. We're going to go over just a bit around understanding the issue of trust in the field of public health. We'll hear from our wonderful partner in Merced County on that county perspective from the local health department. We'll also hear from two amazing partners that work directly in community to get their perspective on trust in public health. And then finally, we'll have time for you all to hear a discussion from these three amazing panelists. And with that, we would love for you to hear who these individuals are. I will be your moderator today. My name is Esther Rivera, she, her, ella. I am based in the Central Valley of California, and I'm with the Public Health Institute. And I'll hand it over to Sol.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you, Esther, for that quick introduction. My name is Sol Rivas, and I am with the nonprofit in Merced County called Valley Onward.
And I am Claudia Corchado. I am the Deputy Executive Director for Cultiva Central Valley, serving primarily our farm worker families throughout Merced County.
Hi, I'm Kristen Sullivan. I am the Public Health Director for Merced County.
And you'll get to hear from each of these speakers on today's session. We can't wait for you to hear more about the work that they have been collaborating on and the ways that they have been partnering. Matters now. One of the pieces that has come up for us at PHI and with our amazing partners that you just heard from is really looking at, in public health, what it takes to be credible, relevant, and trustworthy in this moment. We know that there are polarizing issues in our society. We know that there are still remnants and feelings related to COVID-19 response within public health. And what we know is that in order to do a really effective job and really be present in the field of public health, we have to have trust with community. Community has to feel that we have their best interest at heart and that we're doing what we need to do to protect them. But a lot of that means that we have to build better relationships and really focus on the trust building piece. Not only that, but we have to continue to figure out how we as organizations, institutions, show up as trustworthy. So recognizing where we've been in the past 6 years, which has felt like over a decade or longer, there's a lot of work to be done in our field. Public health has traditionally done amazing work. And that's not to say that we're not still on that spectrum of doing good community engagement, but we know that this moment calls us to do work differently and figure out what it means in this moment to build trust in community and to continue to be trustworthy. So with that, what we know, again, is that trust has been fractured nationally and locally. Responses to COVID-19, to the pandemic, continued issues that come up with public health. We're seeing right now the hantavirus, and just a lot of issues that come up. Trust is something that feels like it's not quite in alignment, whether it be issues with food, whether or not we agree with nutrition standards. We've seen a lot of mixed messaging coming out. And so we know that we're not quite in alignment when it comes to trust, something that we traditionally have been a bit closer in alignment in public health. We know that communities question our intent, relevance, and a lot of times our follow through in terms of the work that we're doing to support them. And we also know that we're navigating a lot of uncertainty and scrutiny and constraints. There's been a lot of changes just in the past year, not to mention changes in the field since COVID began. So just a lot of changes that have happened, a lot of things that impact trust in the field. And again, it's not just about relationships, it's also the communications piece. We have seen quite a bit of a shift in terms of how communities receive communication, how they like to get messaging, what messaging is even effective. And so much has changed in a very short amount of time that it's somewhat outpacing the work that we're doing in public health. And so with that, we decided there needed to be some concentrated efforts in how we link our local government, health departments, and communities. And so I'm really excited to hand it over to our wonderful partner, Dr. Kristen Sullivan, to share more about the county perspective on trust.
Sure. Thank you so much, Esther. So really, as I mentioned, COVID really brought some of the issues that we have with communication to community and then hearing from community and in community engagement in general to a head. It really highlighted some significant fractures in our system. One of the things that came out of that was that really public health practitioners traditionally have wanted to share very precise information that's well vetted and is cited really nicely. And that pace of communication can be slow during the pandemic when really nobody knew much or really anything, and things were changing so dramatically. The communication arms that public health had really did not step up to that challenge. Another component of that was that um, in an area of uncertainty, there was a real resistance to just be very upfront with the fact that there was a lot of uncertainty. I think public health practitioners were coming from a good place and wanting to be, steady in the experts, but what that led it to is misinformation sometimes or confusing information that our community recognized, and then that broke trust. So as we're coming out of COVID, one of the things that we've been focusing on in Merced is how do we fix some of those broken systems? In addition to that, Merced County has gone through a significant internal leadership change. The public health department had almost 100% turnover of executive leadership between COVID and 2025. And so I've been the director at the department now for just over a year. So it was also a good opportunity to take some of those lessons learned and apply them internally as well, because communication had broken down inside of the health department over the course of that leadership transition. So we had the ability to really change the system from within, being more open and honest with our staff, and also being more clear about any time there is uncertainty. So this was a really great opportunity when Esther came to us with this opportunity to also apply these principles out in our community. We were really excited to be able to do that at the same time. One of the things, though, that also has been an interesting challenge for us is that when we have communication and interaction and engagement with our community, the community has a lot of times very clear asks and wants and needs that they have, and that they know better than anybody because they're living in their community. What we find on the county side is that it can be difficult to match those needs to our internal processes or our internal funding. We also have trouble sometimes navigating bureaucracy or taking on new challenges if our leadership is risk adverse in any way. And so this was also an opportunity to explore some of those questions, both within our department and externally with our community partners. Next slide, please. So what changed internally for the health department? We really had to mindfully pivot away from how we have traditionally engaged the community, which tends to be we go out and do a survey for a new grant opportunity that's very specific to whatever the funding source is, into long-term engagement that exists outside of a grant. And what that means is that it's not transactional. We're not just pulling from our community and then potentially not even going back to really cycle through what those next steps might be, but instead going out and engaging the community with the sole purpose being to build that relationship. That really creates consistency and continuity so that those relationships are not dependent on one issue. The nature of public health is that the issues are always changing. And so if we're having to rebuild connection every time there's a new issue, everyone's at a disadvantage. We've lost the trust of the community. The community doesn't have a trusted partner to whom they can turn for good information that they can trust. And so we really found that we needed to just be consistent across the year, and continuing to show up, relying on our established coalitions that were more broad, and that were not always topical, and that really trust is not just um, us convincing the community to trust us, but also us really working hard to trust the community, and to trust the community to know their own needs and to show up.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. I know at PHI, we knew that this moment called for us to do work differently and show up differently. But what we also know is that you have to work with individuals who have communities trust and who know how to operate within the context of those communities and those areas. So I'd love to hand it over to our amazing partners on the ground to share more about trust at the community level and what their perspective has been over these past years and with the Dialogue Project around that work. So let me hand it over to Claudia.
Yes, good morning or good afternoon. Not sure what time this presentation is going to be shown. Again, I am Claudia Corchado. I am the Deputy Executive Director of Cultiva Valle Central, Cultiva Central Valley here in Merced County. We have the honor and the privilege of serving our farm worker immigrant communities now for 20 years. We'll be celebrating 20 years in August. And it truly has been a privilege to be able to build trust. Within those 20 years is trust, right? It's like Dr. Sullivan said, showing up, being present, even if we're just out there handing out water bottles when the community of La Nada was flooded, having to wash clothes so folks can come and pick up clean clothes that folks were donating. Just showing up in communities and not just in our offices, right? But we have to be present out in communities. The residents need to know that as soon as they see our van, there's Cultiva, there's Claudia, there's Annabelle, there's our team of promotoras, it's help and support. But one of the most important key elements to building trust has to be getting rid of language barriers. Not just speaking Spanish for us is an honor, but truly understanding the culture, our quotes that we say, our beliefs, our healing, understanding what that is to our community residents, trying to incorporate that in our everyday work, in our beliefs, is very important to us. We can say 3 words, buenas tardes, señor. That lady is automatically gonna know, okay, I can trust her with those 3 simple words. But speaking in Spanish in a respectful manner, de usted, not de tú, is one key factor too of trust. The other thing I want to say is we write a lot about our communities. We write in grants about their challenges. We write about them. We write about the little community in Planada and El Nido in Winton, but we never write with them. And I think that's one of the other successes too, is for our program, is that we incorporate community residents that are truly facing the challenges, because we don't know the solutions. They're the experts in their communities, and we have to include them when we're writing grant opportunities, when we're asking for funds from funders, and to be inclusive of the community that we are working with. And that means, hiring people from the community, employing people from the community, and to build your team to go out and build and serve more of our community residents who, unfortunately, since COVID, we've been in response mode. Last year we had to be in response mode because of ICE and the fear that our family residents were going through and still are. We have to acknowledge that. But we have to also find a way to listen to them and to be responsive to their fears and their needs. So thank you, Miss Esther.
Thank you, Claudia. Sol, would you like to share a bit more about your experience, both with your organization and the Dialogue Project?
Yeah, I'm glad I was able to follow Claudia. She's been in the work very long, and we do similar work in our county. And so, again, my name is Sol. I'm the executive director for Valley Onward, serving Merced and Stanislaus County. Um, I always talk about I had this question on the drive to school. My daughter says, "Mom, what do you do? My friend wants to be like you." And I'm like, "How do I explain this to an 11-year-old?" As we were driving up, I saw the superintendent at Planada, and he said, I rolled the window and I said, "Hey, what do you think we do? We do work out there." He says, "You all advocate for people." And then my 11-year-old daughter goes, "Well, what does that mean?" And I go, just trying to explain, I think of the grant wording we use, right? The jargon, we're a race and health equity organization. But at the heart of what Valley Onward does is we realize we're talking about trust, the community members are the trusted messengers. I know that that has been such a tagline, right? Who are the trusted messengers, right? For COVID, for everything now. And so we support community leaders that are already community leaders in their community to have the tools necessary to have a voice at the table that sometimes they don't even belong there, or they feel like they don't belong there, or people don't even allow them in those spaces. And so we provide advocacy, organizing skills so that they could change greater statewide policy that directly impacts them. And so we're excited. Claudia brought up Planada. It was a group of residents that brought in $20 million to Planada. And so that was able to be some recovery funds. And so when it comes to trust and this specific topic, I want to thank Dr. Sullivan. I call her Kristen because I've known her for so many years. Um, for being really transparent and honest about the fact that there are many barriers that there for aligned trust amongst community and systems. Whether that, for a 100% turnaround in leadership, when there was leadership before that was built, there's that trust already with community and systems, and then leadership completely changed. That really does a major impact on what was built in communities with systems. Now, that is inevitable. People move up, people move out, but it's always recreating what has been done before. What I would encourage system leaders and those working in systems is to really, really hone in on the expertise, as my colleague Claudia said, in community. The reality of it is these individuals, these residents work, live, breathe, take their kids to school in these communities, and they truly know the impact that is happening. They've sometimes built trust amongst each other, but what we've also realized is that in smaller communities, in particular with this project in Gustine where we worked, and you all can Google Gustine, and see what it's about. Farm working communities, primarily Latinos, but also a very mixed group of, if we look at it in socioeconomic terms or political landscape, there is a difference. Those that are less invested in have the majority of the population. And so in smaller communities, we've realized their brick and mortar are schools. And so we've been able to build relationships, and schools have trusted nonprofits to be able to go in and provide services for community residents. And so trust amongst systems, trust amongst community members, and it takes time to build that within community. Most community members know who that person is if they want to, if like, who do you vote for? I mean, we're talking about during the climate. We know what senora to go to. We know what house is going to be open to give us conchas and cafe and talk about this. If people want to know, do you trust this doctor? There's typically in small communities the people that they go to if they want to know if this is the right doctor or even if they trust public health. How was your experience? They will talk to people within community about systems. And so systems really have to open up and really appreciate the value and knowledge that residents bring to the table. And then, like Kristen said, Dr. Sullivan said, right, is that loop around. And I think this is what this project was really trying to do. Although Claudia and I could very much agree that in the beginning, building trust with this project was super interesting because we had no agenda, no plan of what we want to accomplish, but only talk about bringing diverse people together that are community leaders to be able to build trust in general. And so I know we'll talk a little bit about more about that, but I think the key point that I'm trying to make for system leaders, but also within community, is the fact that trust is built in community. There are trusted messengers and systems partnering with community full circle, not like when you're walking into a mall and then it just goes that little door that's just revolving. It shouldn't be a revolving door and then quick in and out amongst systems and community leaders. It should be a really long process that builds trust together. Even if leadership changes, you know that trust is built in community. Thank you.
Thank you, Sol. Thank you so much. So you've heard a little bit from each of our presenters, and what we want to get into now is just a bit more of a discussion around what exactly was the project that was done in Merced County, and what are some of the lessons learned, and even maybe even tensions that we found as a result of this work. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these backgrounds so you can see all of the beautiful faces of our panelists. But what we want to get into now is just talking a bit more about how this showed up. And so to just kind of set the stage, as you heard, PHI approached our wonderful partners that you see on the screen here about this dialogue project. And sort of our theory or hypothesis was that if we build true community trust among varied perspectives and people from all along the continuum of not only trust in public health, but even like society and political spectrum, like if we can build trust among community members and they can come together to say, this is what we want to champion, we will see longer term impacts, right? And so what I will say is we're very early in this work, so we won't quite be able to share those long term impacts, but we'd love to share with you all the findings. And so I'm going to invite each of our panelists to respond to just a few questions here. And so the first piece that I'd love to hear, and I'll start with Dr. Sullivan, is what surprised you most through this work and partnership with the Dialogue Project?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what surprised me the most is in hearing after the work that both Claudia and Sol were able to do out in their respective communities was how open people became. And we made a very conscious choice to not have system involved in the beginning of this process and in the trust building spot so that the group could really coalesce around each other first before we were inserted. And so, so I've been able to just really kind of watch from the sidelines in a lot of ways. But I think that that's the thing that has really been so surprising to me is hearing about the depth of the conversation that Sol and Claudia have been able to get out of their respective community groups who really started off as strangers. And again, didn't have a topic. Usually we go out and we say, we got a grant to do, tobacco work, and we want to hear about people who really care about tobacco use in parks, right? And so then people who come to those meetings, we know care about tobacco use in parks. But this was such a different experience into which it was really asking community to take a leap of faith and come and talk with no agenda, as Sol mentioned. And I think that I was really delighted, but also surprised to hear um, how deep those conversations got.
Thank you, Kristen. And I will say, just to stay on our theme of trust, that took trust for Kristen to say, sure, go ahead, loop me in when you're ready. There is a certain level of trust as well that early on we tried to build to say, we're going to loop you in, we'll keep you posted. We sent updates as often as we could. But there is that level of trust that had to happen between both the local health department and our partners. So, Claudia, do you want to jump in and just share, what surprised you through this work?
Yes, thank you, Miss Esther. So first I have to say when Esther called and pitched this, and I'm like, you want us to do what? With what? No agenda? Wait, but what about a focus group? Let's start with the focus group. Esther's like, no, just organic conversations that were created with this amazing group of residents of all different ages, of all different stages in their life. We provided interpretation, and the pace of conversations were perfect enough to allow for the interpretations and for those that were listening in to be fully included and engaged. But I was truly surprised because we are so used to here's our agenda. Everybody welcomes each other, checks in, introduces yourself, the usual suspects. But to see meeting one to we had like meeting five was just this amazing progression. And you can sense the trust in the room when you compared meeting number one. There was tension, you can feel it. It was in the air, nobody knew each other. And again, different ages and stages of people's lives. We had folks that were retired. We had young people that were included in the group. Um, and so it was so powerful to see what community residents can build and do and say when we just sit back and listen. And I don't think we do that enough. Is just sit back and listen. Um, so meeting one, it was just dinner. And that there's nothing more personal and powerful. We do this in our homes. Like when family comes over, what do? We're gonna have dinner. So our first session was just dinner, and people started to have these conversations, and you can sense the energy towards the end of the meeting because people were starting to get comfortable with each other. And with comfortable, there's trust. So by our last session, everybody was greeting each other. You know that you have built that trust when people walk in and they're hugging each other. And you see the smiles and you see the energy. And people are like, are we going to have another meeting? We need another meeting. But what we built from that also is now we include our dialogue project participants in any opportunity that we can. There's a mental health fair conference that's coming up. We're going to invite them to come join us. So we are still being inclusive based on what we heard from them and what they'd like to also to continue to work. But I never thought having something with no agenda could be so successful. I do have to give kudos to Mr. Johnny Manson Santos, who came in as a facilitator after meeting two. Amazing facilitator. And he was an external facilitator because I felt if someone brought up something, let's say somebody brought up something politically in our community, it was easy for me to say, oh, I already know the story and just dismiss it almost, right? But if we brought somebody from the outside, he would kind of press, he or she would press on, tell me a little bit more. And Johnny did such an amazing job of doing that, that it brought out like, root issues in our community. So I do have to give a shout out to the facilitator. But I never in a million years did I see how powerful this would be, sitting around in a circle and listening to our community members.
Thank you, Claudia. So I would love to hear from you. What surprised you through this work and through the dialogue project?
Yeah, let me start off with what didn't surprise me because I know community at the heart wants to shape their community. So when individuals in the community reached out, so when we talk about trust, Esther, you brought about Dr. Sullivan being open to letting these nonprofits go out and then only hear from us and not be there. Because, we struggled with, do they come? Do they not? Is it going to be different? Is a system there? A resident's going to be more off-putting, right? And Dr. Sullivan, you could contrast this statement, but in a small community like Merced, we build relationships with each other and trust comes with relationships. And so Kristen has worked with Claudia and myself throughout the years in many capacities. And I hope as she sat in that room as we decided to not include her in these conversations, she says, these two ladies do really good work. I trust them. I trust that they're going to do good and come back with really great results. And so I think relationships are really important. And so what surprised me is the fact for myself is that I had built relationships in communities through our nonprofit that really focused on Latino families that were not represented in spaces. And so I relied on that population to be a part of this group. And those are our base that we've built out in rural communities. Now, what I had to do in full transparency is reach out um, to those that probably didn't align with our race and health equity values, and those, interesting enough, Kristen's bosses, uh, that probably think, wow, the work that Valley Onward does could be very strong in advocating for community needs. But I knew through this project that we needed diverse individuals at the table. And so I reached out to one of Kristen's bosses at the Board of Supervisors. I'd like to give a shout out to Lloyd Pereira for his support and helping recruit individuals that were not those that we typically build a base for. And so that really allowed for major diversity. Now, the surprise comes in crossing your fingers and hoping that those individuals will work with you, right? Um, I wasn't surprised. I have a good relationship with a lot of the board of supervisors, but again, our work is very um, upfront about what needs to be done in communities, and we attest to the fact that there's certain things that need to be done to prosper all communities. And so, going back to relationships, wasn't surprised that Lloyd was willing to work with us and engage some of the individuals. Um, and then when everybody came together, that was just so diverse. Again, like Claudia said, the facilitator was really helpful. And we had activities that made us dig deep into who we were. And so I was nervous because sometimes putting very different individuals in the room that share different experiences can be like, oh my God, off-putting if somebody says something about race, about political values, about values in schools. But I was surprised that people didn't get offended. And I think it goes back to the fact that we broke bread together in the beginning and just sat and got to know each other. And then when the dynamic conversation started, we ate together already. We already got to know each other, and then we talked about really interesting topics to get to know each other more. And so I was just surprised at the fact that people came back and people wanted more. And I bet if we were able to fund more out in these communities, they would come back.
Thank you, Sol. And I'll piggyback on one of the pieces that Sol just mentioned. I know for me, one of the most surprising pieces wasn't that we built trust with community members because I think we allowed that flexibility. I mean, it's always scary going in, being like, we don't have an agenda, we don't have 5 topics to choose from, we're just really going in. But I think what surprised me the most is that we really did build a good foundation. And I know a good example of this was even in Gustine, where to Sol's point, someone brought up racism. And I know that even right now, those listening might be like, oh, do I want to keep listening to this panel? I'm not going to dive into it. But just for a group to hold that and not become a tense space, people really listened to each other. People had a good conversation. And just the ability to build a container with a group of, and in Gustine, it was 20 individuals. So for 20 individuals to have a topic like that come up and hold it and have a good conversation that was like what we call in our community agreements generative conversation, which means that you're growing from it, was something that was surprising because, I mean, you heard our speakers share that there were a total of, in Gustine, 6 sessions. That's I mean, to get to that point, to have a conversation like that, that's quick. And so I think that was really, truly surprising. And for the next question, and I'll start again with our community partners and we'll end with you, Kristen, on this question, is where did those community expectations and those discussions challenge public health assumptions? So Sol, I'd love to start with you. We'll go the opposite way, like a little snake. So where did those community expectations or even conversations challenge some of the public health assumptions we hold?
Yeah, thank you, Esther. So I think it challenged them because of the process that it took. Dr. Sullivan attested to public health, and we've been funded by public health in the past for tobacco cessation, dental, and there's always a clear kind of alignment of what needs to be done. And so it was challenged in the sense of the way things are not traditionally done. And this project did that and brought out, I mean, you explain public health in many layers, right? From the places you go and sit and take your kids, right? Healthy living in the parks. Um, Economic development came out really strong. That I don't know if public health that's like a driving factor in public health, but it definitely was in communities without having a direct line of like, oh, okay, here's tobacco, right? The youth, right? And youth investment came out directly. And I don't know if public health thinks of some of these things, right? But the reality of it is, it does fall under the spirit of public health when you start breaking down economic development and what's being built around you and how that affects your health, right? Are there plants being built, and how that affects overall health? Are there stores being built? um, how are youth being engaged in public health issues, right? And so a lot of that was brought up. And so I think the way it challenged it is by the process it took. And then the fact that the system wasn't at the table. We do have plans of bringing the system back to the table in Gustine. And so I think I go back to the actual process and how it happened that allowed for other issues, other conversations to come up instead of having an agenda coming from an institution and it being organic.
Thanks, Sol. Claudia, I'd love to kick it over to you to get your thoughts on how either the topics or the expectations from community have challenged those traditional public health assumptions.
Yeah, thank you, Miss Esther. And one of the organic conversations that we got to witness was this free flowing discussion of community and sidewalks. Sidewalks always come up in conversations, but putting sidewalks under the lens of health, right? Like we say, when your doctor says, oh, you need to lose a couple of pounds, go out and walk around your neighborhood. A lot of these neighborhoods, we can't do that because there are no sidewalks, or there's loose dogs, or there's a building that's completely tagged up in their community, which creates a sense of unsafety, right? But just the conversations themselves, we too had conversations about employment opportunities. We have conversations about rent, and how, you can't find a 3-bedroom apartment here for less than $1,800, but yet we don't make the money to pay the $1,800 for our rent. And so when you put all of those environmental factors into perspective, right? Like they honed it down to health and the fact that the stress that's caused by our environments, right, impacts our overall health. But it was just truly, it was humbling to see the conversations go from straight sidewalk to someone who is now retired, comfortably retired, right? And they get a pension or a paycheck monthly. But then we have our families that are farm workers that don't get to receive any retirement, right? Because of their status. And so now they're forced to move in with their son or their daughter and their families because alone they can't afford to have their own home. But just listening to the conversations organically, they mentioned public health department. It was maybe 3 times throughout the meetings, but knowing that they understand the power of our public health departments. And I think COVID helped elevate that. Because when we used to ask our farm worker families, do you know what public health is? Oh yeah, that's where I pick up my birth certificate. Oh yeah, that's where I get my baby shots. But COVID truly also elevated the importance of our public health departments and the importance for our community to also reach out to public health departments for support. But again, just listening to the organic conversations that happened, and that list that we created of our community, challenges, that just got longer and longer, unfortunately. But again, it was organic conversations, and these are things that are happening truly on the ground with our community residents. And now our next phase hopefully will be now how do we bring our community residents, right, in a genuine organic partnership with our public health department, and flip the power to our community residents.
Thank you, Claudia. Dr. Sullivan, I'm going to come to you, but I'm just going to kind of segue us from our community partners. And something that was coming up for me as you each were sharing was this famous quote from Audre Lorde, which is, "There's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives." And I think when we think about the challenge that we get from community is, to Claudia and Sol's point, we heard a lot of things in the session, but not all of them have a clean line to governmental public health, right? And there's so many things that touch the issue of health and our ability to thrive in our community and live a quote unquote healthy life. And so I think it does bring this challenge of like, how do we respond to community and react when we also understand some of the constraints that exist within the system of governmental public health? So that's a lot to put on you, Dr. Sullivan, but would love to hear your reaction to what are some of the challenges that come up, and what are just your thoughts around like long term, even how we work to address some of those. So jump in.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question because at the end of the day, really everything impacts the public's health. There's just not a single factor that does not impact public health, right? Like things that have been mentioned here, if you feel safe in your neighborhood, well, that talks about lighting and animal control and potentially law enforcement and other types of things. But before that, you get to economic development and ability to have a job or safe places for youth to gather and activities. And so really all of these things comprehensively all impact a community's health. And we know that, and we've known that in public health, and that's been a main feature of public health for over a decade. When Sol and I first met, she was working in a different project that was a place-based investment, really looking at that idea that different zip codes have different life expectancies, and that's because of investments in different places. So it's not a new problem, and I don't think it's a problem a nut that we've really cracked quite yet. Um, when I did our very first community health improvement plan in 2017, we went out and did focus groups throughout the community. And at the end of it, I told my director at the time, we could just create a community health improvement plan that is parks. That's what everybody is talking about, right? When they talk about access to healthy spaces in their area. But parks are not public health department traditionally, right? But hearing that and knowing that in the last decade, we have significantly stepped up our partnership in terms of looking for funding for parks, providing services in parks, um, safe route to school type approaches. If we don't have a park, can we put a community garden in a school so there's access to some of these resources in areas that kids do have? So while it is not, the public health department is not over parks, nor will we really ever be, we can make relationship with our city parks and rec, and we can make relationship with our county Department of Public Works or our parks department and start to slowly move the needle of collaboration. And I think that is what I have seen over the last decade. And I think that's going to be really important to keep moving forward because you're right. Public health is also not over or involved with economic development, but we are involved with things like access to healthcare, which involves bringing doctors to the community. Well, doctors don't want to move to a community that is not on the rise, right? If they don't see it as being somewhere where there's potential for economic development. So that means that we actually can and do work with our workforce investment board and our workforce investment department to identify mutual shared goals that can improve our communities. And for both of our purposes, economic development on his side, bringing doctors here on my side. So I think that really community, I think people don't know what public health is, but they know what public health feels like. And so when you start talking to them about it, they're able to identify that public health is not just receiving immunization. It is those social drivers of health that really impact our entire community. And I think there's just a lot of opportunity to continue that growth trajectory.
Thank you, Kristen. This next question is getting at some of the realities that we all know exist, right? So, permission to speak in first drafts, as we say. And I'll answer this question first just to take the pressure off of everyone else. What tensions remain between system constraints and community trust? And I will say that probably the tension or the challenge that I see is time and that speed at which we can move. Those pieces just feel like they're a bit in contrast with community's expectations. And when PHI approached this a dialogue project and the thought behind it, our thought was to shift thinking from not a top-down approach, which we know doesn't work, but we also said bottom-up doesn't work either because the system isn't built to support that. And so the goal was really how do we set this linear table? And part of it was a lesson learned. We talk to each community about this really being an experiment and kind of like we're going to learn because we're not sure what this will be. And I think what keeps coming up in my mind is time and the speed at which we can move, which often feels in contrast with community readiness and ability to shift. And so I think for me, as individuals that are maybe listening to this, hopefully we get more than 5 people listening to us. But I think if you're thinking about a project like this, just keeping in mind the time and the speed and keeping that, reality at the top of mind for community, because I think that also erodes trust if we're not transparent about what can happen and how quickly it can move, really doesn't help us in the long run. So really being transparent there. And I think it's a tension that'll likely be a long-term tension, right? We can't just change the way systems work. We can change the way we show up, and I think we're all working on that. But I think for me, in answering this question, the tension for me continues to be time and speed of change. But Kristen, I'm going to come back to you first on this one, and then we'll go to our community partners.
Yeah, I think time is definitely a big one. Just to echo what you're saying, the government does not move quickly. And also, even if we have an idea, there's a lot of involvement around getting buy-in, drumming up support and things like that. So just echoing that. But I would also say a big one, the probably biggest one for me is funding. We just do not have flexible funding. Our department is funded almost entirely by categorical funding, which means when we get that money, we have to deliver on specific scopes of work for that money. So if I have a community member who comes to me and has an amazing idea on how to, increase physical activity in their community, my one and only nutritional education and active lifestyle funding stream was just cut by the federal government. So I would have to see, okay, can we pair this with tobacco, or is there a way that I can tie this into oral health or some other type of creative way, which sometimes we can do, but sometimes we can't. And so I think especially in a poor community, like we live in a resource stressed county. And so some other counties have other funding streams available to them that are local that we don't. And so I think sometimes just that kind of the perception of government being well funded and the reality that we're pretty scrappy, but also our funding is tied to very specific things is a big tension as well.
Thanks, Kristen. I appreciate that. I think that calls to mind what Claudia and Sol mentioned about like our first session, we just had dinner. Like I totally understand that government funds would not be able to support something like that. And I think part of the like how we show up differently is also like recognizing that we have to speak that truth of like, yes, we know what it takes, and also we have restraints around like we get that just having something open-ended is great, but our funding doesn't work that way. And so, how do we partner and collaborate to bring that reality to the table where, while Kristen's team can't do that, Sol and Claudia's team might be able to support that? So, Claudia, I'd love to hear your thoughts on those tensions that are still there, or constraints. I'm sorry, constraints and tensions that may remain from this or that you expect. So, Claudia, you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Miss Esther. And yeah, the constraints continue, right? It was COVID, it was the Planada community flooding, it was keeping up with the different variants of the COVID and immunizations and now the new administration and the threat of families being deported. And so the constant stress of our community residents, I'm sure is impacting their overall health. The the challenge of language barriers, the challenge of being able to navigate complicated systems, um, the fear of entering any form of government building, right? For them to feel that they're protecting their identity, is going to prohibit residents to come into to government agencies. But the constraints like keep on coming. It's like that little snowball, and then it just keeps getting bigger. For example, now we have the challenge of having to support or supporting our families with Medi-Cal re-enrollments, right? During COVID, they were automatically re-enrolled in Medi-Cal. So now we have this huge challenge that family has 60 days to turn in that complicated package of documents in order for them to maintain and retain their health insurance. We should all be seriously concerned on how many families are going to lose their coverage because we can't fill out these really complicated documents. And so again, Dr. Sullivan did a beautiful example of a public health department being responsive to community, because all of our families, it's super important their parks, right? They share their culture in their parks, and there's music in their parks. And that was a perfect example of how these systems can be responsive to our community residents. Another example of how another system is being responsive here with Cultiva is we're going to have a psychiatrist, therapist, counselor actually placed at our office to serve our Latino residents and support behavioral health. Again, changing the dynamic of services that are primarily, in these government agencies, buildings where folks have to go, and there is not necessarily a sense of trust. And I default to the language too, because that is the number one biggest challenge and barrier for our community residents to navigate, and to support themselves and being able to access services. So changing the way that we are responding to community residents and being responsive on how we can support them, by moving and changing these services.
Claudia, Sol, your thoughts.
Yeah, I have to echo Dr. Sullivan. I worked for a system for many years and I understand the constraints of fiscally, how to fund things. And so, um, I know that's a reality, right? And, I also like how Esther mentioned, right, the collaboration. And Kristen, you mentioned it, right, is collaboration. I think speaking very frankly and honesty and being in this advocacy and organizing work for many years. I think there's a lot of biases still, a lot of biases from systems to acknowledge the fact that there is knowledge from, and this is not politically correct, but from, and the way people think, maybe from poor, uneducated communities, right? I think I hear of biases. I think that sometimes we need to take off our lenses from thinking what our personal value systems and political beliefs are, and really think about what's in the best interest of communities. And I think there's sometimes that tension, right? Like we've participated as a coalition. Valion never does anything on its own. We partner with a lot of people, and we try not to work in silos. But we did years ago the Health for All. I mean, Kristen, you were a part of it as a coalition, and systems may see community residents as rattling cages and just yelling at us and doing stuff, and that stays within systems, right? And sometimes being able to realize that sometimes the tension and anger coming from the advocacy doesn't come because of the system, but because of what the cards are dealt with in communities. And it's not anger, but I think it's passion and hurt. And I think there's a tension. And, I could speak for Merced and the work that we've done in community and with community, um, is that leaders might see community as not a value. Leaders in systems, because they might have not had education, they've never worked in a system, they work at a plant. And how is this person going to be able to provide what is needed to change the system? And so, there's the biases that happen. And so I think as we continue and kind of bringing at the forefront what we're talking about is trust, is if we build that trust, we understand live life experiences and really understand why people advocate for their needs. And so if we could build that trust and continue to build a pipeline, even if it's not across all systems, I will give credit to Merced County. The Workforce Investment Board is contracting us, and there's a lot of stuff that I see going. But we have to rely on leaders that really believe in health equity and health for all and healthy neighborhoods for all. And so, just going back to the topic at hand, we have to continue to build relationships amongst community and system leaders so that we could value what all health for everyone in Merced looks like.
Thank you, Sol. I know we're running out of time, so I'm actually going to go off script, everyone. I'm going to give you two options to respond to. You can pick which one you'd like to respond to, but given that there's a little bit of time left, if you could share either one lesson learned from this organic approach that you're carrying forward, or practical advice for those that might be thinking about doing something like Dialogue Project. And I'll let each of our speakers pick which they'd like to respond to. So either a lesson learned you're carrying forward or advice you'd give to someone who's doing this for the first time. And I'm just going to do like a random, we're going to start with Claudia and then we'll go from there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll keep it short also. I think one of the biggest lessons that I learned is how powerful our community residents truly are, and how powerful changes can happen if we allow them to be included into conversations and tables and meetings. And how the uncomfortable silence at the beginning also is powerful. And I appreciate that silence also, but I think my biggest lesson is how organically these conversations started and how they ended up. And the power of just seeing them have conversations like they were at their own table at home having dinner with their families, but yet having these powerful conversations about our overall health and what is impacting our health. Thank you.
Thanks, Claudia. Kristen.
Yeah, I think I'll go with the practical advice one. I think really what I have seen from this and why I think it's so successful is that I think both systems, definitely systems and community have a way of creating an us versus them dynamic. And instead of having it be people, we say, oh, the community, the system, right? And then we treat it as a group or an entity rather than a really important evolving collection of people. I think it's really important for system to realize that because sometimes system will be like, well, we talked to community, and it was they talked to 6 people who showed up on a Tuesday at 8 a.m., you know? And then the community will be like, oh, well, the system is working against us. And the system probably is in a lot of ways, but also the system is people who often are also part of the community. So I think that really what happened here, we had all these diverse opinions and perspectives and ages and groups and languages. And really what that highlighted for me is that we really need to break down that grouping us versus them of these entities and focus on the fact that we are all people and we have shared goals. We all want our communities to be healthy.
Thank you. Sol.
Yeah, that was really heartwarming, Dr. Sullivan. I agree, right? And we've tried in our work for the past 10 years with BHC and trying to change that framework. And so I know you will continue to do that in your leadership at Public Health. So thank you for continually having that message. I would say maybe practical advice. I've heard this before. Claudia was also part of this leadership cohort I was in, and they said, trust the process. And at first, I never wanted to trust the process, especially with that leadership cohort I went through. Okay. Um, but it comes back full circle like after 5 years. And I think you just have to trust the process and know that, like Kristen said, when system and community residents, we are all a whole community. We are a heartbeat of the community and we all invested in community, whether we work in a system or a nonprofit. Like we all live, breathe here, take our kids to school here, we go to the same grocery stores, right? And so it's just trust the process, be open-minded, be willing, um, maybe leave your biases at the door, come with an open heart and an open mind. I encourage PHI to take this on the road and see how it shapes other communities in California. And I'm excited to hear, where we go with this. I know the individuals on this panel, whether we're paid or not to do it, we will be always collaborating and hoping for the best for these communities. And so trust the process, come open-minded, and listen authentically.
Thank you. I want to thank all of our panelists who have been amazing partners over the past, it's almost been a year since we started talking about this. I just want to just shout that out and just appreciate everybody's time, both in being on this panel and doing this work. I think that the Dialogue Project did really great trust building work, and we're hoping that we can build on that. And we hope that those who are watching this panel maybe leave here with some ideas of how you can even start building trust into the sessions that you're hosting and really thinking and reflecting on how you are either working toward trust or maybe where you're not, and really think about how you could show up differently. So I really encourage anyone listening here to think about how you might show up differently in your work and in your community. Thank you so much to our panel. And that's it for us. So thank you all so much for watching. I'm sure we have our slides available on the on-demand session. I will also check in around contact information so you all can reach out to us with any other questions. But thank you, everyone.